evening, and welcome to a very festive Screentone Club. This is your manga podcast for the 24th of December 2019, Christmas Eve. We have to go out and get KFC, apparently. We're recording this on the 17th of December 2019. This is episode 40, in case I didn't say that. My name is Elliot Page, and I am joined by the very lovely, always festive Mr. Andy Hanley. How you doing, Andy?
Ho, ho, and indeed ho. Yes, as you can hear, I'm feeling very festive and not at all exhausted after a very busy December. But yeah, Merry Christmas, everyone.
Sometimes the real joy of Christmas is climbing into a stocking and not being found for a good week.
yeah. It's been. I feel like it's been a weird December for a lot of people as well, because like we had a work meeting where just everybody on the call was like, "Why are we all so tired?" Like December used to be a nice, easygoing time of year that you just wound down to Christmas, but not anymore, as it turns out.
Well, yeah. I mean, we're in the UK and we had an election season, and I got shipped off to Dubai for half a week to do work. And I'll tell you one thing, going into 30-degree heat really screws with your idea of circadian rhythm and all that.
Yeah, I can imagine.
Yeah, also, it was really handy being on a flight so I couldn't, like, impulse check election results when it was coming in. I was stuck, like, for 12 hours, completely cut away from the rest of the world, which was frankly good and preferable.
Yeah. I mean, I tried my best to get some kind of, like, anime gig that involved being launched into space, but apparently there was nothing available, so I just had to put up with it like everyone else.
Yeah, well, you next time just have to audition for Space Brothers. You'll be the third brother, the one in the background.
I'll be the dog, it's fine.
Yeah, that's probably healthier, frankly. Okay, so first and foremost, as mentioned, this is your manga podcast for the week. This is our last proper sort of normal episode of the month, and we're recording this a little ahead of time because, you know, holiday season and all that. But most importantly, if you like what we're doing here, if you like the podcast, please consider supporting us on Patreon. We're gearing up for 2020 with some nice new plans for things we want to do with the podcast. And with your support, we can fully realise them. We're not that far away from having a second bonus episode for Patreon subscribers. So if you fancy getting even more manga content, maybe consider throwing a few pounds our way. On the Patreon bent, shout outs once again to Rob Jessup, someone who, as previously mentioned, is now known for being the person that I call out every episode. If you too want to be called out on every episode, the Patreon's right there. So moving on. The first part of the show, and this is the Returning Champions, where we talk about series we've discussed previously on the show. So I'm calling back to that 12 hours of being in transit. I managed to finally pluck up the courage to finally sit down and read a series we talked about on the show before, and Andy has also talked about in Returning Champions, which is After Hours, the 3-volume romance Yuri coming of age manga. And as mentioned previously, I was quite trepidatious about going into this because I held the first volume in extremely high regard. And even though Andy reassured me that it was good and continued to be very good, I was still slightly scared. And so, of course, being completely isolated in the air in a small metallic pencil meant that I finally found the time to read it. And yeah, it's really good. It's really wild as well, because I'm kind of just want to say that I echo everything Andy said at the previous episode, but also, like, it pulls a Makoto Shinkai, at least in my mind, because volume 3 is like 300 pages, which is quite intense. And after the first 80 or so pages, it's kind of wrapped up. At least it's wrapped up at that point. And I was like, I wonder what happens. And then there's a whole nother arc. So it has basically 3 endings in it at different points. And it kind of does like a kind of love and then loss and then love again sort of direction to it. And it does the thing I love where it has a final chapter and then it has a reprise at the end of a few pages, which is basically like, hey, and we're back to the start again. Everything's cyclical. Check it out. Time's a flat circle. But no, I really loved After Hours. It's gorgeous the whole way through. The characters are really interesting and intense, but at the same time, it doesn't spoil its own lunch or, you know, it doesn't over-egg the pudding at any point. And yeah, it was a complete joy to read end to end. It was just as I hoped it would be, quite frankly. So yeah, my full encouragement to read this only increases.
Cool, awesome. Yeah, I mean, I'm glad you finally made time for it, and I'm glad you enjoyed it in the end, because I feel like it's one of those things I've been singing its praises so heartily. It's like, oh no, what if he reads it and thinks it's garbage? Like, what happens then?
Well, who knows? But yeah, you're right. That's basically it. So yeah, please consider picking it up. I really like these sort of shorter but still very meaty works. Like I say, it's 3 volumes. You can pick it up digitally for £5 a volume. Christmas is coming soon. Maybe it'll be on sale. It continues to be really heartfelt. That's the most important thing for me, is it's very heartfelt and nothing is easy, but it's not cruel. It's very just realistic and empathetic, and there are some amazing moments in it where it all just fits nicely. It just sits well, and you're like, yes, this is correct. Like, this is a good series that knows how to use its impact, and even when things aren't going well, you know, it brings that across really powerfully with the cast and their actions, or inaction, as it might turn out.
Yeah, I think that's the thing that I really enjoy about this series specifically, and it's also something I feel like, especially as you get older and you live through more drama yourself, you kind of come to appreciate series that have a good handle on kind of good realistic drama and not just kind of soap opera kitchen sink melodrama. And I feel like After Hours is a really good example of that. It's like there's some pretty big kind of high stakes stuff for the characters involved, but it always feels grounded and real and like a situation that could, you know, legitimately come into being and kind of, you know, get in the way of kind of a couple's relationship in a really difficult way. And like I feel like, you know, that ending segment of After Hours could so easily have descended into big kind of kitchen sink drama and kind of into all the cliches that go with that, but it always manages to find a tether to kind of, you know, the reality of, like you say, kind of love and loss and kind of family and all of this other stuff, and just ties it all together really nicely.
Yeah, totally. It really manages it all really well. And also there's one thing about it where, like, sometimes the actions that people take is actually just inaction. Like, sometimes you leave things be because no one can bring up the guts to do anything about it. And sometimes that's fine, but sometimes that is destructive. And so it really plays with that well, where the characters can be basically in utter limbo, paralyzed by their situation. And it brings that across well, rather than just being a case of, oh, there's no plot point here for the moment, because it feels like a real sort of interrelationship, rather than just, oh, this is a manga plot.
Yeah, and it feels like a real genuine dilemma as well. Like, it's not just a case of, again, anime and manga is quite often quite keen on having, like, character does nothing as kind of, you know, plot point where it maybe doesn't make sense and you're kind of sat there shouting at the page or the screen, like, just say something or do something. But this is a good example of a series where there is that genuine dilemma of, like, if I say something and say what I think and what I feel about this situation, am I going to be selfish in doing that? Because, you know, in the whole thing that across that 3rd volume in particular, like, you know, both characters kind of, you know, have stakes in whatever decision is made, and like there's a real dilemma of any decision you make being kind of shaded by your own personal desires and wants that might actually then push the other person into doing something that actually isn't good for them. And I feel like that whole kind of quandary is really well played out in that volume. Like, it's not a simple, like, if you just said X, then everything would be okay. It's very much a case of, like, you could change the course of, you know, this relationship and people's decisions, but it could also be something that comes back to bite you and becomes kind of a regret, or kind of, you know, a button for the other person to push in terms of, you know, that relationship falling apart further down the line. And I think that was one of the things that really grabbed me about the story as it kind of gets into its end game, is that, like, it's a really difficult situation for everyone involved, and you can kind of, the decisions everybody makes, even when they're suboptimal or the decision is do nothing, you can always see kind of the logic and kind of the relative merit behind it.
Totally. I mean, there are some instances in the series where where there's misunderstandings that are afoot, and realistic ones, rather than like, oh no, I touched the boob of the lady from space or whatever, because manga. But there's real understandings that are really painful and tied up in multiple layers of pain. But also, you know, as you say, in some cases the characters are in a really snooker position where if they do something and they don't get it perfect, they could just detonate everything, and they know that, but also are utterly scared of anything to do with it. So yeah, it really brings all that to the fore and really makes it all heartening. So yeah, and also even by the end, as a quick side note, I really cared about the extended cast, whereas in the first 2 volumes I was kind of like, who are all this lot and why do they keep popping up? And by the end it's like, oh, okay, I get it. I mean, it works well because it brings you in on the side of the characters, where you are also a stranger to this other cast of characters that are all Kay's friends, and then you get to know them, and by the end you know who they are and what their deal is. So that works really well.
Yeah, that whole group dynamic works well alongside that, where you kind of, again, when a character is being indecisive, you kind of have that group who knows everybody involved well enough to be the ones to step up and say, like, no, look, this is what the other person would want you to do. We know them well enough to kind of give you sound advice and push you in the right direction. And it's like, it's one of the really kind of heartening moments, I think, in kind of, again, late in that sort of, or towards the sort of the tail end of that 3rd volume, where, yeah, all these characters who have just been kind of there and around, and you can kind of take or leave them for the most part, suddenly you kind of realize, like, oh, okay, like the bonds that they have with people are actually important and valuable as well. And it's like, it's a really nicely played out moment.
Totally. So yeah, highly recommended. Please go read it. Basically, listen to our previous gushings about it if you fancy.
Indeed.
Cool. So moving on to the main part of the show, do you mind if I take it first, Andy? I feel limbered up.
Yes, please do.
So this is our kind of, basically it's our Shoujo Beat double header this week, as we're both big sappy sops. I don't know, at least I am. So my first pick was Shortcake Cake, a slightly awkward to search for manga series, because shortcake is one word and then cake is another word. But some search engines differ and some stores are also differ, so whoops. But Shortcake Cake is a series by a duo of creators who go under the pen name of Sue Morishita. It is published by Viz, which means it's only available on some digital storefronts, mostly Comixology, etc. The series is incomplete in English, but complete in Japanese. In Japan, it's up to 12 volumes. In English, it's up to 6. And it kind of sets itself up from the get-go with chapter 1, with you have your main character of Ten Serizawa. See, I made a note this time. Ten is basically a little gremlin. She's got really nice long black hair, which falls into various different hairstyles throughout the series. You can count them on basically 2 to 3 hands. And she's a little gremlin. She started high school, but she lives out in the boonies, and the bus to her school in the morning takes 2 hours through the mountains. And initially she thinks, whatever, I can deal with this. I'm a strong, independent lady who is very cool and collected and very blank-faced, and a bit, she's not an emotionless void, but she's very much a very independent, strong character without being the jokey version of it. But anyway, she ends up nearly missing out on hanging out with some friends because she has to go home at 5:30 because that's when the last bus goes. And her friend, who I forget the name of, but she's basically the living embodiment of bubbliness. She invites her to stay on and stay at her boarding house. And she lives in a boarding house about 10 minutes away from the school. And the first chapter is basically introducing you very slowly to all the different cast members who live in the boarding house, because she's not supposed to have guests. And Ten kind of falls in love with the place and the people there and says, oh, I will move in then. And so she does. So she moves into the boarding house after okaying it with her parents. And then begins the bowl. Ten immediately becomes the focus of a indeterminate love polygon that's currently sort of spiraling and fractaling out. And by the end of the first volume, it kind of goes through a bunch of different character introductions and slow sort of introducing you to the various characters and their foibles and how they live in the boarding house, and there's hints as to their sort of backstory and all that. And then at the end of the first volume, basically Ten wakes up on the back seat of a bus when one of the boys is warning off another boy, hey, don't get too attached to Ten. And then Ten goes, hey, well, what do you mean by that then? And that's the end of the first volume. That's not really a spoiler because it's kind of obvious this is going to be a love polygon story from the get-go. because the front cover has like the three primary hot lads, one of who looks like he needs a nap real bad. And that's where it goes from there, where you kind of have the quiet bookish one, you have the playboyish one who suddenly finds that Kat's got his tongue around 10 because she's so cool and cute collected and so just of her own little world, but at the same time she looks like a little gremlin. The series goes at a great pace, like it really kind of like burns through the whole thing, and so by the end of the first volume it feels almost as ephemeral as a cake itself, because you kind of wolf it down and go, oh, okay, that was the end of the volume. Okay, that was 170 pages and it vanished. Oh, crap. Maybe it's just me, but I don't know. I do like it because it has a real pace to it and a kind of almost dreamlike, softly quality that kind of pushes you through the series. I don't know if you enjoyed it quite to that degree, Andy, or what you thought of the cast, but yeah, for me, 10 definitely is the standout character, mostly because she don't give a fuck.
Yeah. I mean, I kind of find myself liking a lot of the characters in this series, because I think this is a series that all of its characters kind of fall broadly into kind of pretty typical manga and certainly sort of shoujo manga archetypes, but it's if there's one thing that I think kind of runs through every element of this series, it's kind of that it's quite restrained and reserved in how it goes about doing things. And that kind of starts with the characters, because as you've kind of alluded to, like 10 is kind of, she's not completely emotionless, but in a lot of other series, she would be either completely socially awkward or kind of like really, emotionless in that way. But she's just kind of cool and detached enough to kind of be interesting as sort of a protagonist of the series, but she's also like she's not just a complete robot or anything. Like she has feelings, she has opinions, she has kind of points of view and kind of thoughts about things that change over time, and like all of that is really kind of pleasing to see. And then kind of on the other end of that, it's like you've got kind of Riku, who is kind of like the guy who flirts with everybody, who again is sort of a shoujo trope in one sense, in that you always have that guy who's like, oh, he's the ladies' man, he'll just chat up everybody. But like it's played in a really kind of quite sensitive way, in a sense, where you get to spend some time with that character and realize that the flirtiness is it's almost his defense mechanism rather than just being like a bit. It's not just like it's not the thing that defines his character. It's just a thing that he almost does out of a mixture of kind of habit and just kind of a weird sort of self-defense mechanism that kind of 10 just completely inadvertently sort of manages to disarm him from. And that's the thing I really like about kind of most, if not all of the members of the cast, is they fit tropes that you've seen a million times before, but they feel human and real enough that I was like, no, I can kind of get on board. Like, I feel like I know people a bit like some of these characters, and I can kind of identify or associate with them quite easily as a result. They don't just feel like cardboard cutouts.
Yeah, totally. And especially because 10 being kind of very, very disarming and very just take her or leave her means that she basically blows past, like you say, it blows past Playboy's defenses, but also kind of shakes everyone else up as well, which is possibly her charm, as you say, because she's not like a Yuki Nagato completely blank face character, but equally is very much, she's still a little scamp. Like she spends a lot of time in Gremlin low detail form, where she has like a cat smile almost, a whole colon 3. But yeah, because she could, and also like you say, like with the Playboy character whose name I've already forgotten, despite
Riku.
Thank you so much, Riku. Like especially because he's not used to this, and so it's not like he's like, oh no, I love her. It's more a case of, oh, why doesn't any of this work? Why don't any of my defense mechanisms work on her? Do I know what I'm And it's great because it puts everything onto the male cast, where they're like, like they're the ones who are like Doshio, basically, where 10 is just like, I don't care, I've got a beanie, what do you want?
Yeah, and even with 10 and like Chiaki, who is kind of like the most obvious sort of love interest for her directly.
Book Lord!
Yeah, because he just basically like comes out of his room and just quotes literature at her, and she's like, oh, okay, I'm kind of into that. But like even then, it's not that typical kind of shoujo sparkles like, oh my god, like, he's my prince, I'm totally besotted with him. It's just a kind of like, this guy's kind of interesting, and he's also quite hot. Like, you know, and that's kind of like, I feel like that's where it sort of captures the teenage sort of romance experience a lot better. Like, it's very rarely about kind of like falling head over heels. It's far more like, you know, some chance meeting with somebody like, oh, they seem kind of interesting. And like, you know, that is usually the starting point. And I feel like that's what this first volume does really well, because it's a lot of that, of just like, you know, met these people, I've like hung out with them properly, like maybe once or twice, and it's like, you know, there's something there, we get on okay, and that's kind of like, that's the lie of the land at this point, and it's, I really enjoyed that, because it could have gone full bore in any of those directions in terms of just like, you know, massive love at first sight, or just like crazy infatuations, but it's not really. It's kind of a bunch of characters that kind of get on and kind of interested in each other, and you know, it's clearly starting to escalate, but it feels just nicely naturally paced in terms of how that stuff goes.
Yeah, plus I feel like it manages to balance telling you important things about the travails of love in the boarding house type thing, because it's already quietly sort of let you know about the rules. You know, Ten already flouted a bunch of them by being a guest and staying overnight, and also going into boys' rooms, gasp. But at the same time, you know, the stake, now she lives there, the stakes are much more intense of like, you know, Ten has her nice, standard, boring life of having an easier commute to school. But at the same time, it's now like, oh, okay, all this is going to come at me, is it? But, you know, because no relationships between people, boarders in the same house. I mean, you can have a relationship, but you still can't go into each other's rooms. So have fun with that enforced, like, distance and lack of intimacy. Have fun, have fun, teenagers, with all your hormones.
Yeah, which is a nice little bit of kind of low stakes kind of peril, if you like, that the series sets up pretty early on, because it kind of mentions like, oh yeah, like two of the former boarders in this house like ended up in a relationship, and like they're not here anymore, and kind of Ten immediately jumps to the like, oh god, like what happened to them? It's like, oh no, they're still together. It's just like they couldn't live in the same boarding house where they weren't allowed any kind of real interaction with each other. So, you know, one of them moved out, and you know, it's just kind of really, again, it's very reserved and restrained. That could have turned into a big kind of, you know, a whole drama about like, oh, you know, it's kind of the curse of getting into a relationship with somebody from this boarding house. It's just like, no, you can totally have a relationship. It's just like, be aware this will have difficulties that you may want to factor into things.
Yeah, and we're not going to change these rules just for you. And we aren't so much of a silly, crazy shoujo manga that one of you is going to start cross-dressing every other chapter to try and get your kink on. It's more just like, hey, we're all adults here, or nearly. Come on.
Yeah. Yeah, I will say, like, the one thing that, well, I guess there are a couple of things that sort of somewhat broke this volume for me, and, like, not to a massive extent. I still kind of liked it for the most part. I think sometimes its reserved nature starts to feel a little bit stilted. Like, there was part of me that was almost wondering, like, maybe, is there something just a little off with the translation, or is it just that some of the dialogue feels a little bit kind of dry in places where it shouldn't do? And that kind of, especially, I guess about 2/3 of the way through the volume, I feel like there was a run where it was just like, this just doesn't feel like it's quite clicking. It's kind of got the right ideas and they're not quite executing right. And then the other thing that felt really weird to me is like, there's an introduction to a character who's clearly related to one of the boarding house members. That character just feels like he's just dropped out of another manga entirely, because it's just completely like a complete 180 from the tone of the rest of the series. And like for a few pages, it just feels like you're in some completely different world that is way more kind of like melodrama and weirdness than anything the rest of the series it seems to be interested in.
Well, they meet like Mr. Eyeshadow underneath a bridge in a temple, so you know it's going to be weird. That's enough tropes. But yeah, I'm with you that for me, those 2 points you pointed out are the exact same moment of that character's introduction, because it sounds and feels so disjointed reading it, because there's clearly something going on there, but the series is trying excruciatingly hard to obscure it without just immediately cutting out all the speech. And as a result, it's like, okay, there's something going on here, but it's trying extremely hard to not let me know anything, because it clearly wants to keep its powder dry for future events. But it's just annoying. And I will admit, that's one I really enjoy, the kind of slow but still moving sort of pace of events in this series where like not a lot happens in this first volume, but I'm totally cool with that because it maintains a pacing to it and it draws you through the whole thing. But when you do get to that third character introduction, it's like, whoa, this is all just bunched up into itself, and it's, you know, the nice day out on the pond has turned weird, and God knows what's going to happen with that third character, because clearly, given that he's on the friggin' front cover, he's going to turn up again and may in fact be part of the bowl, the 10 bowl. But at the same time, it's like, man, you could not have a less likable character introduction if you tried.
Yeah, and it's just that it feels so out of place as well. It's just like, if this character is going to become kind of a regular sort of part of the entire oeuvre of the series, it's like, what does that mean for it? Like, where does it go? Because it just felt, you know, again, for something that is so kind of restrained and kind of, you know, keeping things on the level, it just suddenly felt very manic for a little while, just kind of completely out of nowhere. And it's like, is this going to kind of lead to some weird shift of tone? Because yeah, like you say, I kind of enjoyed it for what it was up to that point, and I, as much as sometimes, you know, it maybe needs a bit of an injection of something, I don't think that was the something I needed an injection of. Yeah,
true. But no, I must admit I do like it. I like the art because it has like 600 different states for the various characters, from different levels of gremlin to full-on luxurious like character profile image. Like, you get to see 10 in quite a few times where she turns from being little twin-tailed gremlin goblin girl into, oh no, she's an actual, like, she's a woman, like, you know, she is a person of interest, you know, rather than just like a little doofus. So that kind of works really well. And as I say, I like the paneling because it ends up making it through the paneling especially, it has a lot of ways of drawing you along the pages. So again, this is a very quick read because you burn through it in no time at all. At least I did.
Yes, yeah, it didn't take me long to get through it. It was one of those like, wait, was this a really short volume? And it's like, no, not really. It just, it just kind of goes, and it's quite easy to just make your way through.
Yeah, you devour the whole thing in no time at all. Which also is the thing where at the end of the first volume, like I say, it ends on a bit of a bombshell, so it's like, crap. Damn it, you got me. But yeah, I enjoyed it a great deal. I must admit, the first time I read this a few weeks ago, I was really like incandescently hot on it, but now going back to it a second time, I'm like, oh yeah, third character's a bit weird, and oh yeah, this is a bit incongruous at points, but I still really, really like it. Especially 10. Like, I think she's a really great character.
Yes, yeah. I mean, 10, I did find myself, like, I feel like it's been a while since I've read a manga where, like, I just kind of glommed onto the main character in quite the way I did with her, because it's just like, there's just something incredibly pleasing about her, watching her go about her daily business. It's just, I don't know exactly what it is, but it was definitely just like, oh yeah, like, you are just really likable, which then plays so well into the actual story where all these guys are suddenly like, oh wait, she's kind of interesting, and it's just like, yeah, tell me about it.
It's the radio calisthenics. It gets everyone, you know.
Yeah, that's the true secret to true love, clearly. Yeah,
doing exercises at 6 a.m. like a madman. Okay, cool. But yeah, that's Shortcake Cake. As mentioned, currently ongoing. It's finished in Japan, so we'll see. We'll see how much longer it takes Viz to get the remaining half of it out. I'll probably pick up a volume or two to see if it carries on and continues its current path. I have enough to read at the moment, so oops.
Yeah, I'd definitely be curious to hear what you kind of think about it moving forward, because yeah, it's one where it's like, yeah, I could see myself reading that, but also, you know, it's I feel like if someone else is gonna kind of do the groundwork for me and tell me whether I should or not, then I'm all for that.
I mean, it's kind of I've got a huge glut of romance manga on my tablet to read through at the moment because I'm a big soppy baby, but also at the same time, like, when you read a lot of that, the same sort of material and genre, you then start to pick out the gems, and the rest of it fades away into a bizarre amorphous lump of nice but not in, you know, stand out, as it were.
Yeah.
Cool. So that's Shortcake Cake. Thank you very much for that. And Andy, how about your pick? A slightly more frightening series, I suppose, at least personally.
Yes, yeah, indeed. So, yeah, my pick for this show was Nana, which is a series I watched some of the anime of, like, way back in the day and kind of, like, fell off of it for no particular reason other than time. And I've sort of been meaning to check out the manga for quite a while, because it's definitely one of those kind of shoujo series that gets talked about in hushed and some quite often not so hushed tones by people, like, you know, when you're looking for recommendations in that genre. And it's also a weird series because it's 21 volumes long. Officially, it hasn't ended. It's on hiatus, but it's been on hiatus for like a decade now. So I feel like we're probably at the point where we can stick a fork in it. It's done. There's probably not going to be any more, which I suspect probably also means it just ends in some weird place as well. But that's a long way off of this first volume. So Nana is the tale of two Nanas, in fact. There is Nana Komatsu, who kind of takes up the first half of this volume. We're kind of introduced to her as a girl who falls in love way too easily. Like, you know, basically any guy she sees who's even vaguely interesting, she kind of ends up with a weirdly sort of stalkerish obsession with them. Usually ends up being shot down by them. But kind of as we sort of meet her in this first volume, she's basically seemingly kind of been taken advantage of by some older guy who has sort of, you know, been taking her out, dating her, mostly just taking her to a love hotel, if we're honest. And kind of, you know, it feels very much like, you know, she's been his bit on the side, and that's all kind of come to an end. Like, he's moving away to Tokyo for business, and so of course she's heartbroken, etc., etc. And off of the back of that, she kind of swears, thanks to the prodding of her best friend, that she falls in love way too easily. She kind of swears, like, okay, well, like, in future, I'm gonna make sure that I'm friends with people first and foremost. Which then kind of plays into her introduction as she starts at an art school with her friend. They you know, meet some fellow students. She falls in with a guy called Shoji, who clearly kind of has a thing for her from the get-go, but she is very insistent on just being his friend, which causes all kinds of tension, etc., through this first volume, until they kind of finally figure things out and figure out, you know, that they really need to get together and quite literally just get a room already.
Well, they have a pretty hilarious argument in the rain, which was pretty good.
And yes, indeed, they do. So eventually they kind of get together, but just in time for everybody, save for Nana, moving off to Tokyo for their own various ends. Which of course kind of gives her the impetus to want to follow on and move to Tokyo herself. We then move on to the second half of the series and the second Nana, which is Nana Asaki, who we meet as kind of an upcoming singer in a sort of pop punk rock band. One of her bandmates, Ren, is also her boyfriend. And this kind of second half of the volume goes into quite a lot of kind of her backstory of kind of like, you know, her early life, how she ended up falling in with Ren. They're kind of like, you know, early days kind of getting into this band, etc. And then the big bombshell that gets dropped on her is that Ren is going to move to Tokyo because he's been invited to join a rival band that's just kind of hit it big. And so thus we have her own motivation to kind of to make her way to Tokyo, etc. And this is such a weird volume because it is basically 100% setup, like 0% payoff.
Yep.
Which for a big long volume, like, feels... It feels kind of empty at the end of it, which is kind of a shame because there's quite a lot that I like about this volume in terms of the characters. Like, I think are all kind of interesting and enjoyable, even over the course of this first volume, because it's spread over a reasonable time frame on both sides of the stories. You kind of get to see them grow and kind of learn from their mistakes and figure things out. So kind of like watching them do their thing and kind of, you know, orbit around each other on both halves of the story is kind of interesting, but it's also really frustrating because, you know, it almost feels like it's not even like you get to kind of the final page of the final chapter and you feel like you know exactly where it's heading in volume 2. It's kind of like there's a lot more of this, but it doesn't really give you any exact feeling for kind of the direction or how these two stories are going to mesh together. You can kind of see the basics, but it feels like there's so much kind of left undone that you've read a lot and you're still really no further forward in certain senses, and that is pretty frustrating, I found, by the end of it.
Yeah, I probably didn't find it quite as frustrating as you, Andy. I mean, from the moment I opened the volume and you see the table of contents is literally the two characters' names and then the omake, it's like, okay. Like, each of these is basically a big one-shot. And I wasn't quite expecting it to be quite as intense, but they're both basically origin stories, except without, like, superpowers or anything. And even in the omake at the end, where you have Junko, who's probably the best character of the entire lot, quite honestly. She's also the single most sensible character of the whole lot, where she basically has the omake and says, yeah, this was basically the origin stories. And then one of the nanas is like, what, are they introducing more nanas? And it's like, no, you two are it. This is just the idea. But it is real gnarly having like 100 pages each for setup for these two characters. And in some ways, it feels like a really crazy flex by the author, Ai Yazawa, who also did Paradise Kiss, I believe, which is also hilariously big, well-known sort of thing, like massive pillar of the genre. But it feels like a really intense flex where Ai Yazawa's basically just said, right, take you 100 pages for each of these characters, and it's going to set them up kind of, but still not really resolve a single damn thing, because the whole thing is basically backstory without any real sort of development from there. Because in both cases, the move to Tokyo is the big hard cut in their life that they're leading up to, but equally is the thing that's tied up with lots of different pains and horror. And like I say, the main reason I say it's a big flex is because it basically gets to show you two very, very different characters with the same name. Ooh. But it gets to do that, but also have such a different focus. Like, for example, you have Nana Osaki, who has really intense living situations, and that's what kind of clearly informed her. And, you know, she was a high school dropout, but doesn't really care. She has her band, she has Ren, and then just as much she doesn't. And after the, like, lovelorn and constantly, like falling in love first Nana, it's really different because the focuses are so different in what it chooses to look at and show you, whereas the first bubbly Nana is basically like almost a charmed existence who just kind of flops her way through life and ends up basically just puppying alongside her friend Ranko, who is the really cool character who knows what the hell she wants to do. And so you do get this really interesting, like, not direct comparison, but you do get these two different stories. And like I say, it feels like a really powerful way of saying, this is how I display this character, and this is how I display this other character. And they haven't even yet met. And yeah, you have all these different baggage and stories. And, you know, one of them is like immature to a point of being exasperating. The other one is like much more mature, but also just kind of unlucky or wrong place, wrong time sort of thing. And, you know, is perhaps even too mature by far. And so you get this crazy difference and no, as you say, payoff as such. I mean, you get plenty of payoff in the stories themselves, but at the same time, it does feel like a pair of anthology shorts that are very well accomplished and very fun to read and kind of intense at times. Like the first Nana is slightly more sort of awkward to get to terms with until you get the entire what her entire deal is, and when she starts basically treating the guy who likes her like just a bud. And until then, it still doesn't feel like it's really kind of got into high gear, which, as you say, makes it a slightly strange read because you've got all this stuff that's happened, but yet nothing has actually really happened in the story.
Yeah. I think it's just that wish that it kind of, because I like and I'm interested in both of the main characters. I just felt like I needed something to kind of hang my hat on to be like, okay, yeah, I see where this is headed, and that is the kind of the carrot on the stick that makes me want to read a future volume. Because yeah, like I feel like had these been presented to me as, you know, two one-shot stories that just like end where they end, I'd be like, yeah, okay, sure, that was pretty good. But like I feel like I just wish it'd give me a little bit more to work with. But yeah, I don't know. Like, I mean, it is interesting, like to see those characters' backstories, and they are both backstories that are kind of worthy of the time that they're given. Like, I will certainly say that for it. Neither of these two stories feel like they're being kind of stretched out for the sake of it. Like, you know, the first Nana has a lot of stuff to work through in terms of kind of, the way she treats relationships, and it's actually really satisfying to see her start to figure that stuff out. Also really interesting, like you say, like her friend is kind of one of the best characters here. Also really interesting just to see her kind of change and progress as she gets into a relationship herself. Like she goes from being sort of the cynical, like, why do you even care so much about all of this stuff, to being kind of somewhat more lovey-dovey and perhaps more understanding of kind of Nana's situation as a result. And then the second Nana is, it's far more kind of intense, far more hard-edged. Like, visually, that half of the series feels way more confident. I don't know whether it's just because, like, the author had kind of got into their groove at that point, or whether they just feel more confident depicting that character. But, like, it felt way more, there were way more kind of, like, striking panels and kind of moments in that side of the story that just kind of really stood out to me. It's just like, this just looks really cool and is really accomplished and really kind of visually striking in a way that the first half never really manages to find, much to do in that regard.
Yeah, I feel like the second half has a lot more to say with the art and a lot more it wants to show you, like, Ren and Nana's apartment sort of thing, and the geometrics of that bath they share, where, that feels meticulously sort of researched almost. But the first half of it, you have a lot of panels where it's photographs with a filter over them, or large amounts of screen tone, and it really gets rather tiresome because the backgrounds that are shown are rather indistinct and kind of a nothing. So it feels kind of like unmoored from time and space in a weird way. Whereas again, the second one, it feels a lot more located and firmly planted, and it has a more realistic end to it rather than like stupid girl can't stop falling in love .text almost. But it's one other thing about the series as well is because it is all set up and backstory is that you can basically see it like burying the landmines in front of you. Like a lot of the various elements and plot points it shows you are very clearly not completely finished, and someone's going to set them off at some point or other. There's a lot of stuff that it's not unfinished, but it's basically done, and it's in a package where it's like, this is going to be a problem later, or this will be revisited in a future date. And so you get all this stuff that's, it's not like it's hanging in front of your revision, but it just becomes a bit exhausting, where, especially for the first Nana, where it's a case of, okay, all these chickens are going to have to come home to roost, and that's what's going to be in the other N volumes of this series. Which again, kind of maybe is what leads up to the feeling of it being a bit unsatisfying, because you have all this stuff that it clearly wants to detonate, but not just yet. We've got to get this introduction out of the way first.
Yeah, for sure. And I think the other thing kind of on the positive side that I enjoy about this, which, again, I guess this is almost more a comparison to so many other sort of shoujo works, is that, like, this is a very sort of adult work in terms of, like, characters have sex, characters get horny, like, it doesn't kind of shy away from any of that, and it's always refreshing to see that as well, and it's not just kind of played in the titillating kind of way, like, it's just a natural part of, like, hey, people are in relationships, this is how this stuff works out, and, like, all of that is just depicted very well, I think, throughout, and it kind of, it adds a bit extra, I think, to kind of the relationships involved. Like, it's not all just chase, X likes Y. It's like, no, there is a physical attraction here with these relationships as well. Like, there's a physical element to it, and that is also an important part of it that we're not going to shy away from. We're not going to just, like, pretend it doesn't exist. And I think that kind of adds power to both of those characters' relationships, that, that is part of the dynamic, whether it's perhaps, as the situation Nana is in at the first Nana is in at the start of her story, where it's just kind of, that is basically what she's being used for, through to kind of second Nana and kind of Ren's relationship, which obviously is also kind of a very sexual one as two people who live together as well. But I think all of that stuff is really kind of well played and kind of naturally just kind of added in to kind of give a bit more gravitas and depth to those relationships.
Yeah, I feel like the one place it kind of falls down somewhat is with first Nana and like Soft Boy. I forget his name. The guy who is drawn far too pretty in his first panel. But basically he like starts saying, "Oh, you should be careful, like men will jump you." And it's like, oh God, you're such a fucking loser, because he can't just say, "I like you," and stop treating me like an eternal friend. So it's really stupid where he's just like, "Oh, you got to be careful, men are beasts." And it's like, you are finding the worst way. You found like the worst way to really kind of play on someone's fears and not get the message across, dude. Like, way to go.
Yeah, I mean, he dude need some lessons from Flirty Guy and Shortcake Cake. Like, clearly there needs to be a meeting of minds between those two. Like, this is bad flirting. This is okay flirting.
Yeah, totally. But yeah, it's wild. But yeah, as I say, I was initially quite sort of scared of this series because of the high regard it's in, and also it's a bit of a monolith in the space, really, as being kind of one of the standout names. I mean, also it helps that the name is really easy to remember, so you're not going to forget it, really. But yeah, so I've come down on it kind of in a weird position where I would maybe like to read more of it, but knowing there are 20 more volumes and also it's on hiatus kind of cools my ardor a bit, as well as the fact that like I really don't care about First Nana so much, and if anything, I would almost, it's weird where the setup has all been very interesting, but at the same time there isn't really enough to drag me on into a second volume. Like at this point I can kind of put the book down and go, right, okay, fine, whatever, done. So yeah. I think that's exactly where I'm at. It's like, overall, like, I think this is actually a pretty strong volume in a lot of ways. It's just as a tool to kind of lure you into future volumes, it's maybe suboptimal, and I think, again, perhaps at the time it was being published, that's perhaps less of an issue, but yeah, once you start looking at it and kind of thinking about how many volumes there are and how long that's going to take to get through, plus the fact it's on hiatus, kind of, maybe pushes the equation toward me not wanting to read any more of it. But it's, again, like, I'm glad I read it. It's very easy to see, why it is kind of popular in the space it inhabits. Like, it absolutely deserves to be, because it does a lot of good stuff. But I just wish it just had that one hook that made me think like, oh yeah, okay, this is definitely something that I want to read more of. But it never quite gets there. Like, I feel like I'm perfectly satisfied with the one volume that I read and kind of seeing the story of these two characters up to that point. And that's just kind of fine in itself. Like, I feel like I don't really need necessarily to know any more about them, which is almost weirdly like the quality of the first volume working against it in that sense. Yeah, it works really well as a pair of one-shots, and then it's kind of done. So it's real stupid. But yeah, as I say, I feel it's worth its plaudits, but yeah, at the same time kind of left me cold. So I can appreciate it, apart from the constant photographic panels, but can appreciate it, but I'm good at this point, honestly.
That's fair.
Yeah, cool. So, anything more about Nana, Andy?
No, I think that's it. I'm done.
Cool. So, as mentioned, this is our last episode of 2019. Join us for quote unquote season 3 of the podcast in 2020. What we can talk about for the first episode of 2020? Well, I have picked another romance / life coming of age story that I remember when I was first getting into anime, and it was very highly talked about as an anime then, but kind of missed me because I wasn't really into any like fan subs at that point. But that would be Honey and Clover, Volume 1. And Andy, how about you?
Yeah, I mean, I'm interested in your pick because I'm one of the people who was nagged at constantly to watch the Honey and Clover anime and was told like, oh, it's definitely in your wheelhouse, you'll love it. And then I watched it and was just like, that was all right, I guess. So I'm actually interested to see what the source material is like because, as people have quite rightly said, it should be very much in my wheelhouse. And my pick for our first show of 2020 is actually something that's getting an anime adaptation come January, so I was kind of curious to read the source material, and that is Samari and the Guardian of the Forest Volume 1, which has confusingly been translated differently as Samari in the Forest Spirit for its anime adaptation. So someone on the manga side is publishing side is going to be kicking themselves about that one, I suspect.
A pair of marketing departments are probably rather upset. It's like, we missed a co-marketing deal. What the fuck? So So,
Indeed.
yeah, cool. So, thank you very much for listening. As always, you can find the full list of episodes and the notes on the website, Screentone.club. If you like the podcast, please consider telling a friend, tweet about it. That sort of stuff is how we get new listeners, quite frankly. Ratings and reviews are very greatly appreciated. Thank you to all the people who have rated us. I found out we actually do have 12 ratings that come out to a 5-star average. So, hooray! We're totally great. Thank you very much to everyone for that. You can follow our Twitter at Screentone Club. You can send us an email at show@screentone.club. My name is Elliot Page, and you can find me taking a Twitter break at Elliot Page. But next week, when this comes out, I will be posting cat pictures again because I'll be in the house with the cats in. Hooray! Andy, how about you?
You can find me on Twitter, where I'll doubtless be finding plenty of stupid things to post over the festive period, at Hannah's1979.
Are you going to post more pictures of giant cows again, like last year?
I mean, possibly. Like, apparently my parents just randomly had, like, horses appear in their garden the other day, so who knows what kind of... I may be living some kind of, like, silver spoon dream over the Christmas break.
Make sure you don't trip over any pizza ovens.
If I...
Oh, that's a point. Silver Spoon should be out digitally now as we record this. Oh, damn. Oh, man. Okay, anyway. Whoops. I know what I'm doing after we finish recording. So thank you very much, everyone, and have a lovely holidays and a prosperous 2020. We will see you then.
Indeed. Have a great Christmas and New Year, everybody, and goodbye.
Bye.